Hello, Kerbonauts, and welcome to episode 2 of Red Duna, where we're building the Ares from Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars, and we're taking it to Duna with 100 plus Kerbals on board. Today, we're actually going to work on one of the very most important and core modules, and that is the Spire. In the novel, Robinson describes this as a hexagon shape. So as you can see, we're trying to fit 6 tanks here onto the central spire. And it really just comes down to how many girders, how many struts, how far away are the mounting points. And as you can see, we're getting close. And in general here, I'm going to show the editing footage sped up along with the flight footage, because one of Kerbal's primary demands is that you're a very patient game player. It's a slow paced game. And there's a lot of, very small, minute tweaking in here. So what I'm trying to do here is, if you're watching the video, is just get the size that the spire needs to be. How many of these girder segments, how tightly packed all the little components are going to end up being in here. And this gives me, the basic sort of unit for this build, because the ship is built around the standard tank size, right? So they make a big deal in the book about how the extra tanks from the shuttles were used to build all this equipment. Big orange tank, right? It looks very familiar. It's one of our favorite Kerbal parts. It's nothing but fuel. And the sizing turns out to be pretty tricky when you're doing this, and you have to remember that all of these parts have to be assemblable in orbit. So when you're doing something of this scale, the move tool becomes super important, because you're going to be tweaking the locations of parts up and down these builds here. You notice I keep resetting the build so that I'm building a single unit from the top, and that's just to really simplify things. The editor gets a little wonky when you work in a lot of radials. So we keep snapping back to the top here. Okay, so we have the spire part, and now we're building the tug to drive it around. Okay, so I have the spire and the tug now. Why not rebuild the tug around a smaller thing? So the spires actually need to be drivable themselves on orbit, because they're going to end up having to position themselves. So you see at the base of the spire there, the very bottom between the docking port, is a command module, and that makes each spire its own separate little spaceship. And they will only have RCS, but here we are loading up RCS tankage for them. Now notice the tanks are going to be sort of on the outside. We want the center of mass of this piece to actually be very close to the docking apparatus here at the end. Not only does that make it easier to launch when the ship is assembled, that means the mass in each of the ring is going to be as close to the outside as possible, if we were rotating it, would really, really help with stability. In this build, it's just going to make for a better launch for what we care about. All right, so now we have the spire and we have our sideline docking ports. So you see the other notable thing here is that tank in the center there. And there we are assembling a standard tank, simplest part in the world. Okay, and that is a pretty good alignment. So you see the part here, the tank fits neatly between two of those spires, just so. So that is going to be the sort of standard spire and tank arrangement. Now this is different than the one that we saw in the last video, which had the spires coming to the center of the tanks. This is the one that I went with just partially for assemblability, but also looks. This is going to look a lot nicer when it all gets put together. And once we've got, so the geometry is set there, I'm working on the strutting and the bracing. You can never have too many struts, right? As we all know. Positioning is critical in these elements, so we spend a lot of time working with the move tool to tweak. I mean, you have to remember that there are 8 tori and 6 spires per torus. So this has to be just right, because when you're done, there's going to be 48 of them all together to build the Ares, right? There's each of these is then launched with a tug, and this is sort of an early tug design, or this is a reusable tug design that I've developed over the years playing the game for different scenarios. Of course, the thing that's really easy to forget in the tugs is you need a big old RCS wheel, and there it is, because the tugs really have to be able to, like, move a lot of material around. Now here I am, sort of, it looks like I'm spamming and adding more solar panels than are absolutely necessary. The thing is, those reaction wheels use a lot of power. And in a later, we'll see in a later thing, I stripped some of those out and I regret it. So future me is here to say all the power you can get on those tugs, you put on the tugs because they need it. Okay, so here we are. This is going to be, we're getting close to the configuration for the first launch. So it's a Spire and a standard tank, and we put it on a standard booster, and we put it into a standard orbit. So the assembly orbit I'm using for the Ares is approximately 150 kilometers square. 150 is nice because if you come up low or behind it in orbit and you want to catch up, you can put up 150 by 125 ellipse, and oh, hey, what's going on here? Something tells me that's not making it to orbit. All right, so we had a little stability issue. We're going to add, more stability control, maybe some Werner thrusters. Those sometimes help. And line it up. All right, play with the gimbals some. So I find on these bigger engines, reducing the gimbling range, especially with relatively lighter loads, gives you a lot less wobble and shimmy. The other thing that we learn in, here we go, more struts. All the struts, right? Just keep adding struts. Rule number one of strutting, though, you strut from the bottom to the top, and we'll get into that one in a later, but I learned from that particular operation there that you have to be careful what order you put your struts on in. Okay, here we go. This one, I think, is for the game. Okay, little roll. Just fire the engines up, get it back, turned around. Come on, we can do this. We can do this. There we are. All right, nice. Yep. Okay, lot of shimmy, lot of shimmy. Okay, settle. All right, so very long rockets like this. This is what I call a very spindly sort of build. And these are tough to fly. What you learn is that you have to take your G-turn very late. So this rocket really wants to be launched pretty much straight up until its apoapse is close to the target orbit. And only then, and then only once you're outside of the atmosphere, is it really safe to turn it and start angling for that G-turn. Not the most fuel-efficient flight profile, but in the case of this particular load, the best one to use. So here we are coasting up to apoapse. It's like a nice run. All right, and then now we're burning to circularize. So that's going to take the last little bit out of that big tank. Pop. So we're fuel out there, and we'll drop it. It'll fall away. We'll unlock the fuel canister for the next one, and off we go. All right, so as we're burning to circularize here, we're going to check some of these other tanks, see what the levels are, check our orientation, make sure all the RCS stuff works. See a really nice view of Kerbin's limb just on the horizon there. Okay, and then now we're looking at our orbital insertion saying, we need to burn up a little bit. So, Kerbin's orbital mechanics, of course, very fun and very accurate. As you can see here, I'm having to burn pretty much radial out, and that's to move my apoapse out ahead of me. So the apoapse had gotten behind me. I was descending back into the atmosphere. So, the way what you're doing with the engine and the orbit is you're adding energy to the orbit in different directions. So if you burn out, the orbit is basically going to move outwards with you in the direction that you're putting energy into it. Okay, there we are, dropping away that last little orbital insertion booster. So this is in a relatively low orbit. I think the periapse on this is actually in the atmosphere, which is kind of sketchy, but fortunately I planned ahead, and my tug is equipped with RCS engines. Ta-da! So even though I'm doomed to fall back into the atmosphere if I don't burn reasonably hard here to circularize this orbit, I happen to have... There you go. These 4 guys are going to make a big difference. Ironically, we have plenty of fuel on board. That tank there is half full of liquid fuel, but it has no oxidizer. And liquid fuel is there because the Ares is powered by nuclear engines, and the nuclear engines need liquid fuel, but they don't need oxidizer. And we're just going to have one whole ring plus the central spar of tanks with fuel in them. And that's, the reaction mass that's required to get a ship this big all the way out to Duna. So here we are, parked gently in orbit, relatively circularized. We're actually going to leave this one here and go back to the Space Center and go back to the pad. Okay, so our first Spire and fuel tank is already in orbit around Kerbin, and we're just going to actually reload that exact same model. Now, the next thing that we need is a central tank, and the central tanks for the Ares are the docking ports where all the Spires plug into. So as you can see, we've got the small docking port there, and we've set it up for hex symmetry. And we're just going to test this by... Whoops, yeah, whoa. There we go, there. By docking our Spire up against it and seeing what happens. Now, this time I'm docking the Spires in, yeah, there we go. So I got a single symmetry because, oh my gosh. So the goal here now is actually to find out how far apart the docking ports on the tank need to be to keep the Spires from colliding with each other. So there's a little adjustment, a little tweaking. Okay, we figured that one out. So what we learn is that we can have 3 rings per tank, right? So the plan for the Ares actually calls for 8. So that's going to be 2 tanks with 3 and 1 tank with 2. The tank with 2 is probably going to be the one in the back, closest to the engine build. But this is the first one that we're going to send up because this needs to be anchored right behind the bubble dome so we can start building the first ring behind it. So you see there we've got decent clearance. And part of the plan is that once this is on orbit and assembled, these Spires are going to be attached to each other with struts using the Kerbal attachment system while we're on orbit. So we're actually, there are already a ton of struts on each Spire, and we're going to be then strutting them to each other so that the whole thing becomes a much more solid structure with respect to the physics engine, right? Because the whole game here is making sure that the physics engine doesn't allows us to move this vehicle around reasonably well. So now we have our spacing for these 3 things, and we just need to put them back in there with hexagonal symmetry. Boom, boom, boom. All right, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is our central tank. So we will need 2 of these, 1 more perhaps special build with only 2 rings on it. We'll see if we can just use a standard one and forget the last ring. And then as with every other launch here, we need to put a Spire on top of it because for every... uh-oh, what happened? Where'd it go? For every tank or tank-like segment, I should say, that we put into space, we need to have a corresponding Spire to go up with it. So what you'll see in the launches as we move forward is we'll be launching 1 tank segment, so either a tank or a central tank like these, or another part that is designed to be the same size as a central tank. With the Spire on top of it. So we're going to have a lot of these kind of wibbly-wobbly launches. We'll be working on, strutting arrangements for the towers over time to make sure they all survive into orbit. But, this is a large number of launches. This is a huge launch campaign to build this vehicle. And so the series is going to go on for just a little while. So here we are on the pad with our first central tank, and having learned what we learned from the previous launches, so there's a couple of things I'm going to point out. The first one is that off the pad, we're at 3/4 throttle. Now, the other thing I'm going to point out is that off the pad, we've got a really nasty rotation. And if you notice, the nav ball there was all brown. So the problem here is that the control, yeah, and there it goes again. Okay, so I'm going to fail this launch again and just let it roll through, and we'll edit this bit out here. Oh boy, yeah, it's ever the optimist. We try to recover this. This flight is deemed irrecoverable at right about now. And the problem you'll very quickly realize is that the nav ball is upside down. And that's because the vehicle is being controlled from a part that is upside down on that spire there relative to the vehicle. So to make the launch work, we have to control the vehicle from a part that is right side up. So if you go to the tug, you say control from here, and look at the sky is blue and the ball is blue, and now we can put this bad boy up in the orbit. So lifting off at a little over 2/3 throttle. This is a wibbly wobbly, very spindly build, so we got to be a little easy off the pad. And also you're coming up through the thickest part of the atmosphere. So we're going to actually kind of take it nice and slow until those external tanks burn out. At that point, we want the full thrust of that Rhino, so we'll go to 100% throttle after we drop the side tank. So this is a nice, slow climb. And by the time we drop the tanks, we should be up around 10,000 kilometers. Normally, that's where you'd start your G-turn. But for this particular build, we're going to let the Rhino take us up to our apoaps or at least 100K. And then we'll start our G-turn into orbit up there. So nice slow burn into orbit. You can see the external tank fuel is dwindling and dwindling and dwindling away, and we're checking the capacity in the main tank. And flame out of the external engines. We'll drop those. Away they go. Little boom off camera. Check that orbit. See where we're at periaps. All right, and then now that we're up at 15,000, climbing nicely. There, you can see the sky is getting that beautiful dark. The atmosphere is falling away below us. All right, and so the throttle is pretty consistent right now. It might have even gone down a little bit. And as you can see, this is a straight up shot. We are directly above the space complex. All right, and now we've transitioned to orbit. So the physics model is updated and put us on rails, and we're in orbital space. So up above 40,000 meters, and now we start that G-turn that we've been contemplating for a little while. So roll program comes in, or finishes, and we're coming down at 90 on that 90-degree vector to pull us into a nice, pleasant equatorial orbit. I'm playing with the orientation here just to see how the shimmy can best be managed. I'm going to warp ahead to the apoaps there. There we go. And finally, we're going to burn to circularize this one. After much orbital monkey business, we are now about to converge finally with the bubble dome. So here we are at our convergence point. And this is the first tank we launched. As you can see, it's not the central tank with the attachment points. We're lined up on the target. We have a pretty decent... We've killed most of our relative speed distance. Now we're going to just line the target itself up. Okay, yeah, there we go. So we've actually run out of fuel in the girder. So the bubble dome here is actually going to have to go and fetch that girder. So we have enough RCS fuel on board to pull this off pretty easily. There's our tug for the bubble dome. We're just going to line up on the tank and scoot on over there. Say, hey guys, what's going on? So, matching orbits is a slow and careful process. A lot of little adjustments, a lot of RCS thruster burns, and a lot of patience. Again, Kerbal's a very patient game. You have to be willing to slowly watch the tank drift by and then readjust. I mean, even with time acceleration, some of these things can take, hours. So we have not only the time acceleration in the game, but the time acceleration in the video editor working for us. So we can get through this in less than our entire lives. But it really does illustrate, one of the reasons I wanted to do this build was to sort of investigate the challenges of doing large construction in space, right? This is beyond rocket science at some level, because we're really talking about stuff that no one's done in the real world, and we it's fun to play with it and do it in the simulator like this. And then whoops, little ding there on the instrumentation as I flip around and smack that booster at that tug stage. Now this is a little awkward because, of course, the only docking ports available are these tankward ones. I take that back. There's one at the end that I could have snapped onto, but because this is the bubble dome, which is the front of the ship, and this is not a tank that we're going to put into assembly. I'm actually going to dock it right here just for a second. Just scoot right on down. Now these big docking ports are great because of their structural integrity. They're relatively easy to dock against, just if you get the right amount of push there. Okay, so funny looking ship, right? Part one, but all the parts are together and seem to be in reasonably good shape. And now we're just going to target that with this other port here. And from this guy, we're going to control from that port and target the part of that one that we want to dock up against. And let's go to there. So we get lined up. So the two ships are basically lined up against each other's docking ports, the SAS instructions. And then we just drive one into the other, swapping back and forth occasionally with your right bracket key so that you can keep the two of them properly lined up. SAS does a pretty decent job of this as long as you switch ships periodically so that it can resync, because of course ships that are not currently being piloted are not currently being piloted. So Kerbal has this funny notion that there's only one ship can be driven at a time. Maybe one day we'll have true multiplayer and the ability to fly in formation together. That'll be fun. So we're having a little rotation issue there, but we should get this guy snugly into that docking port any second now. Lined up, and bump and grind. One of the problems, if you don't quite get it, turn off your SAS and push your RCS jets forward, and that'll kind of bump you into the thing. Turn the lights on and off so you can see how things look. So, funny looking ship, right? I kind of like it though. So this is it. This is the Ares and the first Spire and the first tank and its tug in orbit. Now let's go get that second Spire and that first central tank. These guys are a little bit behind us. I'm going to skip over and fast forward through the docking section. Excuse me. Okay, here we are with our second tank. This is a central tank and our second spire. As you can see, we're getting sort of closure on the orbits there, and we're warping in to where we have a really good close encounter. Boom. Now we're going to have... Yeah, let's just have a look there. So you see they're pretty close. We're going to line up on the target. Wait for that to stabilize. Get a little bit closer. Okay, and there you're watching. We're getting almost there, almost there, almost there. And oh, it's so close. I love these super close encounters. Okay, and then we just run it forward. All the way around Kerbin. Closer every moment. Until we reach our closest encounter. And then we scoot around and we line up retrograde. And we make sure that we have the right... And we burn hard retro. Retro. So we're out of liquid fuel on this one, and I don't know if we have jettisoned that canister yet. So we have nothing but RCS jets, and we're working those RCS jets extra hard to try and kill that relative speed as best we can. And we're down in the 4 meters per second range. So let's line up on the target and start pushing in the target's general direction. Okay, so here, oh, nope, not yet, not just yet. I'm going to kill a little bit more relative speed. Look at that, those vectors lined up nicely. So now we're aligned to the target. Got our lights on, check the lights, check lights. And we push forward. We're out of fuel there, so we're going to jettison that fuel canister. I don't know why we didn't do that earlier, but... Alright, and now the final docking approach. Now this is going to be an interesting one because, of course, we don't have a good surface to dock against, except for the back. Yeah, so let's check on it. Where am I going to put this thing? Well... Let's get a little closer first. And as we're getting just a bit closer to the target, you can see it coming into range here. Let's skip ahead a second and a little more. And we're lining it up very, very carefully. Now, we're actually switching control to one of the sideline docking ports. And on the main structure, taking the tip of that spire there, and lining it up to that sideline docking port. And the goal here is this is actually going to be the first segment that's correctly in place. So here we are, RCS thrusting our way very delicately and gently, trying to balance that out. Tricky with so many reaction wheels at work, and whoops. Takes a couple of turns. But eventually, here we are with our little spaceship embryo. See you next time for Red Duna.
The stars are banging close to me.